It's very inspiring to hear Robert's talk earlier this afternoon, and I like to think of that, the kind of work that he does, as taking the issues back to the streets. And in many ways, I think on the issue of abortion particularly, it's on the streets that we've got to win this by the witness. It's not we can win the arguments intellectually, but actually they're not listening. We have to do it man to man, one soul at a time. On the other hand, we also do need to win the arguments. So if Robert's engaging in the ground war, what I'm going to do this afternoon is the air war. So the ground war, the stuff on the streets, it doesn't work ultimately if you've lost the arguments. I think with abortion, we have won the arguments. It's just that they can't accept it because it's just incompatible with their way of life. It's incompatible with their choices, incompatible with their self-respect. In some cases, you've got to approach it in a different way. But there are arguments which are going on, which are real, and which are affecting people at a very fundamental level. So I apologise in advance. This is a rather a different kind of talk from Robert's, but it's an opportunity for you to test the ability of my book to send you to sleep. If I manage that in this talk, then there are still copies of my book for sale at the back, and in the long run, it'll be cheaper than sleeping pills. So I'm going to talk about modernity and postmodernity, and the liturgy and marriage. And I'm inspired in my own talk by my own writings, naturally. So I've written all about this stuff, and the talk I'm giving this afternoon goes beyond what I've written. So in fact, you won't find any references to postmodernism in my books. So what you're getting here is new. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there you are. So the problem posed by modernity is central to the two books I have brought with me, which I published last year. The Liturgy, the Family, and the Crisis of Modernity, and the Intellectuals and the Latin Mass. In the first, I attempt to answer a series of objections to the movement in favour of the traditional Mass, and in the second, I and other contributors put forward a series of positive arguments. In practice, of course, you can't really do one without doing the other at the same time. The central idea in both is the conflict between tradition, particularly in the form of the Church's traditional liturgy, and modernity, in the sense of the impatience with tradition characteristic of the Enlightenment, on the basis that tradition is backward and stifling. In this presentation, I will focus on this core theme of the books and take the argument beyond what I say there by bringing in postmodernity, the ideology behind the woke phenomenon, which partly accepts and partly reacts against the Enlightenment. As I will suggest, this presents us with new dangers, but also new opportunities. So what is modernity? One aspect of it is the economic transformation brought about by the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and all that stuff. Mass communications, in particular, had a profound effect on society, and I talk about this in the books. How they disrupt social networks and undermine culture. Today, however, I'm going to focus not on the metal bashing side of modernity, or even on the electron bashing side of modernity, but on the ideas. The ideas that characterize modernity are individualism and rationalism, whose canonical expression is to be found in the 18th century European philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment. Individualism and rationalism tend to be conceptualized in opposition to something else, the traditional situation before they came along, or to the remnants of tradition which continue to exist. This is a kind of there is a kind of individualist and rationalist morality tale, well represented in fiction, in which a brave individual throws off the prejudices and limitations of tradition in order to exercise his freedom and achieve wonderful new things. To express this rather crudely, this little story encapsulates individualism as the idea that individuals don't owe anything to their communities, and rationalism, the idea that each person can think things out from first principles. Just think of recent Disney films and things. My definition of a tradition would be a practice or belief handed on to us from the past which is regarded as normative, which is to say is regarded as a guide to action. Traditional societies have customs and shared expectations and recognised life pathways. The mission of modernity, the Enlightenment project, is to destroy traditions in the name of freedom, self-realisation and creativity. My response to modernity is going to be that it saws off the branch it's sitting on, which is rationality itself. I'm not the first person to recognise this, and my critique is shared in important respects by postmodernity. Postmodernism presents a new challenge to tradition, what we might call the reality-denying movement. The ideas of this movement are so startling that some people long for a return to what they see as the relative sanity of modernity. However, just because modernity took a couple of centuries to collapse does not make it a safe refuge or something we should try to rebuild. We need to come up with something better. So the first part of this, modernity's war on tradition. The modern or Enlightenment attitude is that, at best, any limitation on our freedom must be constantly expected to justify itself, and any possible doubt about its importance should result in its being abandoned. This is particularly destructive of the great value of it's particularly destructive, as the great value of tradition is its ability to preserve hard-earned wisdom without necessarily articulating it. For example, the oddly complex food preparation practices of some traditional societies incorporate ways to remove poisons or make foods digestible. No one in the community may be able to articulate why the process works, but if they are faithful to the tradition will keep them safe. The same can be said, of course, of many social traditions, which often have a value which few, if any, of their practitioners is able to put into words. This is fairly well-trodden ground. I want to explore a more fundamental problem with the Enlightenment project. One way of expressing this is to point out that in dismissing tradition, they seem to make an exception for the traditions they like, such as the tradition of Western mathematics. For mathematics is a tradition. It is a set of rules preserved by a community and passed down by our predecessors, and I guarantee that very few practicing mathematicians, let alone people like engineers or accountants who apply mathematics, would be able to give a full justification for every single rule. Far from it. At the more fundamental levels, in fact, where the philosophy of maths come in, the rules turn out to be controversial and contested. Despite this, mathematicians who follow the rules come up with solutions to problems that can be applied in real life. You won't believe the amount of time philosophers spend arguing whether 2 + 2 is 5, how we know it and what it really means and so on. Even more fundamental than mathematics is the tradition that is language. Language is a set of conventions sustained by a community, passed down by the generations, and characterised by rules we agree as binding. It is, obviously, a tradition. The rules of language are obviously historically contingent and arbitrary. Other languages have other rules, and they're just as good, except they're not the same. The rules comprise a vast body of complicated and frankly inconsistent norms, and the arbitrary assignment of meanings to signs by mind-bogglingly complex historical processes. For all this, only when we have mastered our own language and are in the company of other people who have mastered the same language can we start talking about logic and propositions and all the things rationalists like. Should we break out of the constraining and often arbitrary rules of language and mathematics? Well, you can if you like. No one's going to stop you, but you won't be able to communicate with anyone or solve any mathematical problems. Traditions not only restrict our options, but make things possible that were not be possible without them, a point I shall return to. Language is in fact not the most fundamental tradition. While we are conscious, we are assailed by a vast number of sensory stimuli. The first thing humans have to learn to do is to work out how to sort these into patterns and distinguish the important ones from the background noise. The pattern of light comprising my left eyebrow and the bottom half of the exit sign behind me does not represent a single object, but this is something which we have to learn. How can you tell? The distant rumble of the road is not important, but the very special tone of voice saying something about the hot stove may well be. And again, this has to be learned. Babies, we now know, start learning about things in the womb, becoming able to distinguish the voices of different family members, for example. Getting up to speed with perception, spatial awareness, and all the rest of it is a massive undertaking, and the understanding we acquire can be expressed as a set of customary rules, not articulated, let alone codified or justified, but rules all the same. Plenty of ontologists, not to be confused with oncologists, but the subspecies of philosopher who worry about these things so the rest of us don't have to, will tell us that the distinctions between different objects in our field of vision are in fact arbitrary. They're not real distinctions. They're not fundamental to the nature of things. Well, that's as may be. What we have to decide, though, is what's important to us in finding a way across a room, for example, getting out a front door or crossing a road. Do the rules of perception place restrictions and limitations on us? Yes, they do. Because they tell us what there is for us to deal with. Not an entity comprising a chair leg, a white shoe, and a section of carpet, but a person, a chair, and a floor. What we are able to perceive can constitute, for practical purposes, the field of our action. We deal with people and animals and objects like tables and buildings. This is the basis upon which our moral assessments are built next. Now, you may be thinking that I'm starting to sound a bit postmodern, and indeed I am. For this critique of the anti-tradition project is indeed a plank of postmodernity, to which I now turn. So, modernity is a rebellion against tradition because it wants to maximise freedom. One aspect of this, of the freedom is at issue, is the freedom from values and moral restrictions. Enlightenment thinkers associated with the Catholic past, and indeed their association is often correct. When they considered the non-Christian countries which were being discovered in their era, the 18th century, and often colonised, they were equally scornful of the traditions they found there. Don't ask an 18th century philosopher what he thinks of the South Sea Islanders. You won't like the answer. It is perfectly true that traditions embed values. They were right about that. The difficulty with rejecting traditions on this basis, however, as I have just tried to show, is that the concept of tradition is much wider than the heirs of the Enlightenment generally assumed. Mathematics, language, and even the way we perceive the world can be said, like other traditions, to be contingent, in the sense that it could be different, and also value-laden. That is to say, contrary to an unspoken Enlightenment assumption, even the kind of knowledge they admired the most, scientific knowledge, is not something perfectly objective, value-free, a factual reality, a magical mirror held up to reality without fear or favour. It is reality interpreted through the lens of our own concepts, which categorise things in a particular way according to what humans in some particular tradition regard as important. The judgment of importance is, naturally, a value judgment. Once we've got a sense of what is important and what is not, our decision-making will be shaped by that understanding. In this way, our perception of reality is based on past judgments, not by us, but by previous generations of our tradition, and influences future judgments. This is, or ought to be, a shattering realisation for the heirs of the Enlightenment, because the whole point of their project or the part of their project which concerns us here, is freeing oneself from the irrational prejudices of those dreadful Catholics and embracing the unvarnished truth. It doesn't bother me at all, speaking as a dreadful Catholic, because I think the values that lie at the bottom of how we perceive reality are either objectively correct, or, if there is a different way of doing things, then at least perfectly defensible. As we pass on into the high-level traditions and value judgments, I might well have some objections to make, but I'm happy to argue it out case by case and not insist on throwing out baby bathwater and all. There is, in fact, a famous concession to this reality in the more recent tradition of post-Enlightenment philosophy in which I received my own academic training. It is called Neurath's boat. Apparently it was invented by Tom called Otto Neurath in the beginning of the 20th century. The boat is a metaphor for the complex structure of our beliefs. We carry out repairs and improvements to it, but we are not in dry dock. We are at sea, so we are obliged to do it one plank at a time. This is the recognition philosophers today make of the fact that Enlightenment thinkers were at once over-ambitious and naive. However, the postmodernists take a different tack. In some ways, postmodernism takes the modernist critique of tradition to its logical conclusion. Some Enlightenment thinkers noted that language is value-laden and wanted to reform it, and postmodernists agree. The urgency of their task is amplified by the fact that postmodernists have inherited a Marxist concern with power relations. All communication, they say, is a means for one group of people to dominate and exploit another, and no amount of language reform is going to erase this. All they can hope to do is to change the dominant group, as the Marxists of old wanted to swap in the proletariat for the capitalists as the people in charge. This is the project of the current woke movement, who want to valorize the traditions of the people they regard as historically subjected to unjust domination. So, in New Zealand, for example, the creation narrative of the native Maoris is now found alongside the Western scientific narrative, the Big Bang and all that, in school textbooks. When some scientists protested about this in 2021 on the basis that the Maori creation myth should not be presented as though it were an alternative to the scientific account, the New Zealand Association of Scientists issued a statement to contradict this protest. They affirmed, and I quote from them, "While as scientists we clearly see the value of science and the good it can do, we must also acknowledge that science has an ongoing history of colonising when it speaks over indigenous voices, ignores indigenous knowledge, and privileges a limited Western-dominated view of science." I don't know whether there's some special inflection of voice which I should have used to indicate that indigenous is spelled with a capital I. Western, of course, with a lowercase w. Now, if you want to have a bit of fun on a wet afternoon, I understand there are such things as wet afternoons in Galway, you can Google Turtle Island to see the North American equivalent of this debate about the Maoris. The best-known dogma of the woke movement is gender ideology, the denial of human sexual dimorphism. On this topic, many listeners may well be on the side of the old, starched collar-wearing, often anti-clerical and quite possibly racist European scientists of the Enlightenment tradition, who would have regarded this as pretty strange. One way in which I part company with the old scientists, apart from their being anti-clerical and racist, of course, and actually agree with the postmodern people, is in accepting that this statement, that humans have two sexes, is value-laden. This claim derives from a conception about biological reality that reflects the interests and needs of humans, and it has implications for how we should behave. That is, after all, what anyone in the tradition of Aquinas' theory of natural law would say, that these kinds of facts do have implications for how we should behave. It comes in part from values, it points to values. Science and values cannot be so easily separated, but I happen to accept the values at issue. If postmodernism collapsed tomorrow, which is far from impossible, many modern assumptions would re-emerge to take its place in the short term. But nevertheless, modernism's contradictions are now too evident to ignore. To express the problem with modernity another way, what the Enlightenment assumed were universal values were and remain Western values. The imposition of democracy, secularism, the university system, blue jeans, rock music, and a whole lot of other things onto the entire world, which is what has actually happened in the last century or so, was not the self-realization of every imaginable culture, but the imposition of modern Western culture on everyone else. Some of them are good, some of them not so good, but let's not pretend they didn't come from the West. As the preeminence of Western power wanes, this is a reality which is becoming harder and harder to deny. Modernism's effect will last a long time, but as an intellectual movement, it is finished. We have to adapt ourselves to a new challenge and also not fail to take advantage of modernism's acknowledged deficiencies. So we shouldn't be fighting the last war. The time has come to put to bed some of the most cherished doctrines of modernism, doctrines which have done immense damage to the church and to society. I would like to illustrate this with two examples on marriage and on the liturgy. So, marriage. Traditions constrain what we can do. This is obviously true. We all feel obliged at Christmas time to go through various domestic rituals, such as decorating the house. We do this freely, but the tradition is powerful and we feel its force. But as well as limiting what we can do and forcing us to do certain things, these traditions surrounding Christmas also make possible something that, if the traditions did not exist, would not be possible otherwise, to wit, the celebration of Christmas. There would be no Christmas as we normally understand it if we and other members of our communities did not follow the traditions of Christmas. If the traditions were abolished, Christmas as a cultural reality, which brings with it opportunities for generosity, hospitality, fellow feeling and reconciliation, and which is such a powerful and positive aspect of even post-Christian Western culture, would never be experienced again. The tradition has created a possibility that has value, and our fidelity to those traditions maintains that possibility. This applies with even greater force to the traditions surrounding marriage. To make this argument, I'm going to read a section from the family book. This is a kind of preview. There are those who view the institutions and forms of life that have grown up organically in human society over time as not only offering us as individuals basic protection, but also as giving us meaning, making possible complex life projects, beauty and understanding. This can be so even if those institutions and forms of life, usually lacking the guarantee of revealed religion, are imperfect and in need of reform, and even if a wide range of non-conforming lifestyles are in practice tolerated. Those on this side of the divide will nevertheless want to preserve these institutions and forms of life, to improve them if possible, and to pass them on to future generations. On the other side of this distinction, there are those who think that all such institutions are oppressive. Detailed argument about specifics need not detain us, as human freedom is impeded on this view whenever our understanding of the world or our life options are decisively influenced by pre-existing cultural norms. On such a view, loosening such norms is progress, but abolishing them altogether is the ultimate goal. Only when there are no cultural expectations, no categories, and no conventions will we be truly free and truly able to express ourselves and develop authentically because only then will the full range of possibilities be open to us without impediment. To illustrate, legislation to permit divorce under certain circumstances is presented as increasing the freedom, the options of married people. These options are still further increased if divorce is made easier and easier and easier. Sooner or later, in implementation of such reforms, we arrive at the point when there is no longer any difference, legally speaking, between being married and not being married. This is the situation for the liberal of ultimate freedom, but it is also the point at which marriage ceases to exist for practical purposes. The conservative points out that this process has not increased freedom at all. When marriage is abolished, it is removed as an option. People can no longer marry. They can only do what they could have done anyway, namely engage in some sort of open-ended cohabitation. Not only that, but the option represented by marriage is an extraordinarily rich and interesting one, since the lifelong, socially recognised, sexually exclusive commitment makes for an especially fulfilling kind of relationship and opens up possibilities for relationships within and between families which are otherwise impossible. A society in which the idea of a lifelong commitment is absent, where there is no legal or social norm which allows a couple to be publicly recognised as committed to each other, is obviously a society in which one cannot seek fulfilment through married life. It is one, supposing this society were possible at all, it is one in which the goods offered by marriage, as traditionally conceived, are not available. It is not only poorer from the point of view of the welfare of children, but also for the life options of adults. Just as certain liturgical liberals within the Catholic Church will not be happy until the ancient forms of liturgy are completely obliterated, so those who regard traditional marriage as oppressive will not rest until no one is permitted to marry. It is not enough that some people with varying degrees of legal toleration may live lives which conflict with established norms. The norms themselves must cease to exist, lest they even influence people's life choices. As Simone de Beauvoir famously said in a 1975 interview about the vocation of the housewife, quote, "Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one," unquote. The process of loosening, trivialising, and ultimately abolishing the cultural institutions, expectations, and shared meanings of Western culture is the great project of Enlightenment liberalism. It is not ultimately a coherent project because it is impossible to live without anything resembling these things. In the name of freeing us from the oppression represented by these values, the post-Enlightenment project constantly narrows our cultural resources of what we can do, say, or imagine. Its complete victory is impossible, so in practice, after each liberal victory, society tends to coalesce around reformed or simplified versions of the various institutions, or else reacts against the process with new forms of allegiance and solidarity to replace the old ones, often taking ugly forms. What is possible, nevertheless, is what liberals are pleased to call progress. The weakening of one institution or norm after another, or their replacement with artificial substitutes which offer less restraint and less meaning, and may even be, as George Orwell warned, the tools of new forms of oppression. End of quotation from the book. I should emphasise that I don't think all traditions are perfect, or even good. I'm perfectly happy to read about the tradition of human sacrifice disappearing, and I'd be content to see mafia traditions going the same way. My point, rather, is that if we understand all the ways in which traditions can have value, we will be much more cautious about destroying them. The onus is on those who wish to demolish, which is always so much easier than to build. What of the postmodern take on this? One of the things that postmodernists have picked up on is the importance of traditional ways of life. The problem is that they are only interested in the ways of life of people they regard as historically oppressed. I say this as a problem not because I don't agree with them that these ways of life are worthy of special attention, insofar as they are endangered or are important to the lives of people suffering all sorts of economic and social problems. They do indeed deserve special attention from politicians, educationalists, and others. The problem derives from the extreme partisanship of the framing given to the issue by the woke branch of postmodernism, which makes it impossible to have a serious conversation about the nature of anyone's traditions or to give any consideration to the traditions of culturally dominant groups. These are also important, if only because they are the traditions of an awful lot of people. As we are already experiencing, the problems caused by heterosexual white males formed by a self-confident patriarchal Christian cultural tradition are as nothing compared to the problems created by heterosexual white males who have been deprived of any meaningful life narrative by the collapse of their culture. The woke people should be careful what they wish for. So my second example is the liturgy. So the Catholic Latin liturgical tradition has long been the focus of criticism by rationalists, and in the 20th century it succumbed, in a certain sense, to that criticism. The ideas of the liturgical reformers had a number of sources, but a key underlying concern was to at least blunt the force of the rationalist critique of the liturgy. An Enlightenment rationalist would characterise the ancient Catholic liturgy as obscurantist, as exalting obscurity for its own sake as if it were a positive thing. Whereas, says the rationalist, if we want people to benefit from the liturgy, we should ensure, if possible, that they can hear it, and in a language they can understand. People should be able to see what is happening. And, to quote the Second Vatican Council document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and I quote, "The rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions. They should be within the people's powers of comprehension, and normally should not require much explanation." Unquote. From a philosophical point of view, however, rationalism is not the only game in town. If you asked the Romantic thinkers, who also emerged in the very same Enlightenment period, they would have been much more friendly to the idea of a liturgy which appealed to a sense of wonder, to our aesthetic sensibilities, and directly to the emotions through music. In any case, we are not living in that era now. As I've already noted, rationalism is old hat. The postmodernists tell us that rationalism is a Eurocentric tradition and that we should embrace alternative rationalities embedded in indigenous creation narratives, and so on and so forth. I suppose that's what comes of the church thinking in centuries. In the 1960s, she finally came up with an answer to a question she'd been asked in 1780, or thereabouts, only to discover that people are now asking different questions. Nevertheless, we still need to address the Enlightenment objection because the answer the reformers of the 1960s came up with was wrong. Addressing the rationalist critique now is a lot easier than it was then because the people we are talking to tend to be much more broad-minded than their predecessors about what form the answer can take. The objection, to repeat, is that the liturgy, in a language we do not understand, with mysterious ceremonies and all the rest, can't convey anything useful to us. It is essential to be able to answer this question, not just for people who love the traditional Mass, but for all Catholics, for lots of reasons. First, saying that the Catholic liturgy was useless for 12 or more centuries completely destroys the Church's spiritual credibility. Second, while the Western liturgy was reformed to make it more acceptable to people influenced by the Enlightenment, the Church's Eastern rites were not. And these are even less Enlightenment-friendly than the Latin Mass of the West. This must have seemed frightfully clever in the 1960s because the Eastern churches didn't face rationalist criticisms as much as we do in the West, but the blatant inconsistency is not a good look. Third, millions of Catholics around the world attend Mass in languages not their own, including languages they do not understand. For example, the Mass has never been translated into Cantonese. If you grab me afterwards, I'll explain why. Hundreds of millions, about 100 million Chinese people speak Cantonese, not Mandarin, and indeed many Chinese Catholics are Cantonese speakers, not Mandarin speakers. They go to Mass, they don't understand it. Similarly, it hasn't been translated to any of hundreds of African languages. It has been translated to some, but there are many, many hundreds of other languages it has not been translated. It would be totally impractical to do so. Those Africans have to go to Mass in some other language. They may understand it, they may not. The Church tells the Cantonese speakers, tells these Africans, go to Mass anyway. Why? There must be a good reason. Fourth, despite the liturgical reform of the 1960s, the Catholic liturgy remains irreducibly mysterious. The Novus Ordo Missae may have fewer and simpler ceremonies. The words may be in the vernacular, and it may be celebrated facing the people, but it still contains silent prayers and mysterious, more or less invisible ceremonies and theologically highly complex texts. I have in mind the priestly prayers, such as Lavado, supposed to be sent silently, rituals like the addition of a small amount of water to the wine of the offertory, and Eucharistic Prayer 1, the ancient Roman Missal. Massgoers who even notice these things will nearly all struggle to understand them or explain them to others. The mystery at the level of individual ceremonies is matched by the mystery at the level of the Mass as a whole. As we all know, the Mass is the unbloody representation of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, during which Christ comes into the host and wine in the chalice, which become his body and blood. Few things less amenable to Enlightenment principles or more contrary to an Enlightenment understanding of rationality can be imagined. As an early campaigner for the present preservation of the traditional Mass, Bernard Wall expressed it in this way, and I quote from him: I could not understand how statements made in the Roman Mass would be more understandable if said in English or French rather than Latin. I could not see how the different words made these mysteries any more explicit. They were what the ancient Greeks called holy mysteries. End of Bernard Wall. This is all to say, we need to be able to answer the Enlightenment objection, and those who aren't interested in the traditional Mass should be grateful to those of us who are put in the hard work of articulating responses to it, which can be used to defend the Novus Ordo as well. So, here's my answer. Normally, when we talk about understanding something, like the French subjunctive, heaven help us, or a diesel engine, we have in mind an intellectual operation such as would enable the learner to explain the content he had understood to someone else. The quotation from Bernard Wall I just gave protests we are never going to understand the Mass in this sense, and that understanding in anything like this intellectual sense is completely the wrong tool to bring to a discussion of liturgical participation. However, I think many of the people who talk about understanding the liturgy mean something a lot broader than this. They aren't expecting people to be able to sit an exam on the liturgy after attending it a few times. Perhaps what they mean is getting something out of it. So really their question is, how can you get something out of a Mass in Latin with silence, mysterious ceremonies, and so on? This very different question starts a very different conversation. You can get something out of listening to a song in a language you don't understand. You can get something out of looking at a painting where there are no words at all. You can get something out of spending time in silence with a person you love. The people who go to the traditional Mass must get something out of it, otherwise they wouldn't go. Odd as it seems, liturgical participation is actually aided by the features of the traditional Mass that were largely removed in the liturgical form specifically in order to aid participation in liturgy. Having the Mass in the vernacular, being able to hear and see more of it, and having simplified prayers and ceremonies were all intended to facilitate an intellectual grasp of the rites, and they succeed in doing so. But there is a lot more to participation than the intellectual content of texts and ceremonies. Participation in the Mass is about prayer. It follows that things that help you pray help you participate. If things that help you pray impede your intellectual engagement with texts and ceremonies, that may well be a price worth paying. In my book on the family, I talk about the fact that the traditional Mass is obscure in the sense that elements of it are hidden, silent, complex, and in Latin. This obscurity is something we notice at the same time that some of the details of the ceremony or the texts are hidden by the obscurity. What is important to notice is that the obscurity itself conveys something to us. The fact that we are dealing with a mystery. So here's another passage from the book. Obscurity as a symbol works. This has been noticed by all sorts of people. I like to quote Pope John Paul II, who noted back in 1980 of the Latin of the Mass that, and here's a quotation, through its dignified character it elicited a profound sense of the Eucharistic mystery, unquote. I could equally quote Pope Francis, who, talking about the liturgies of the Eastern churches, said that by comparison with them, and I quote, we have lost some of the sense of adoration, unquote. I don't need to labour the point. When Pope Benedict XVI referred to, and I quote, the sacrality which attracts many people to the former usage, unquote, he was just stating the obvious. Some people like the traditional Mass, and they like it because it conveys very effectively a sense of the sacred. Yes, the use of silence, Latin, ad orientem, and complex ceremonial conveys with perfect clarity the sacred character of what is being done. It does, moreover, not as a self-conscious messenger, but as a witness. You could put up a big neon sign above the altar which flashed up the words, "This is sacred," and it would not convincingly convey the message that this is sacred. Instead, we know that what is going on is sacred in character because we can see that those involved regard the liturgy as something which merits the use of a sacred language, complex ceremonial, and silence, and regarded as something which, because it is directed to God, should be done facing east, the direction in which everyone else is facing and from which we expect Christ to return in glory. To look at another aspect of the liturgy, many volumes have been filled on the meaning of truly obscure liturgical symbols, such as the addition of a small amount of water into the wine of the offertory, to use an example also found in the Reformed Mass, or the dropping of a small portion of the consecrated host into the chalice before communion. This kind of thing, at least to me, is very interesting, and I recommend those numerous volumes to those who wish to deepen their appreciation of liturgy. However, it is evidently not the meaning of the ceremonies at that granular level of detail which convinces the onlooker that something stupendous is taking place. It is rather the higher level fact that this is a rite with many complex and intriguing details. That fact is obvious, even to a first-time participant, and its meaning is not obscure, it is clear. It gives witness to the seriousness, the solemnity, the richness, and the profundity of what is going on. It is interesting that those particular examples were maintained in the Novus Ordo Missae, while so many other little ceremonies were removed. The canonical fingers, the double genuflection of the consecration, multiple signs of the cross made over the gifts, the ringing of the bell at various points, the ritualized kiss of peace, and so on. These, for my money, the ones I've just mentioned, are actually considerably easier to understand than the first two examples, which were presumably kept primarily for their antiquity. These are the ones somewhat more recent in the history of the liturgy. What they all contribute to, however, is the richness of the rite. The more you look into it, the more there is to see, and the more there is to discover about what you do see. It is, in fact, an inexhaustible field of study. The ancient liturgy possesses irreducible complexity, a complexity that does not disappear once you get to a certain level of detail. End of quotation from book. What, you ask, are the postmodern people going to make of this argument? The fact is, my argument is precisely an argument in favour of alternative rationalities and all that postmodern guff, because, actually, they've got a point. The Enlightenment intellectuals who thought that the only things worth considering were propositions were wrong. They failed to consider non-verbal communication. They didn't take symbolic actions seriously. They rejected the whole notion of the operation of grace. One of the fathers of the Enlightenment, René Descartes, identified the mind with the conscious mind. As one wag put it, he undiscovered the unconscious mind, which then had to be rediscovered by people like Freud. Do traditional societies have wisdom that the Enlightenment rationalism talks over, as the New Zealand Association of Scientists put it? Yes, they do. Those of our opponents in the church who are more plugged into woke ideology have responded to the rise of traditionalism by trying to link the traditional mass to something that the woke regard as unredeemable, what they call white culture. There is a steady trickle of articles in liberal Catholic outlets like America Magazine and Commonweal saying that traditional mass congregations are lacking in diversity. This might be dangerous to us in a woke environment were it not so ludicrously out of touch with reality. The traditional mass is the product of the ancient Mediterranean world at a time when Europe as a cultural entity didn't really exist. And it has important contributions from the Holy Land and from North Africa. The Reformed Mass really is the product of Enlightenment Western European culture. The traditional Mass has a special appeal to people from more traditional spiritual cultures, cultures which take seriously ritual, the numinous, and a sense of sin. The Reformed Mass was engineered to appeal to a decadent West that had rejected precisely these things. The liturgical reform was promoted by making fun of how primitive and superstitious the ancient Mass was. Well, the boot is on the other foot now. I have come to enjoy these articles about the traditional Mass and white supremacy because of the social media reaction, as the Irish-American journalist Michael Brendan Dougherty expressed it recently on Twitter. I quote from him, "My traditionalist Catholic parish is the most racially and socio-economically diverse and integrated institution in our lives. If I wanted a white-only Catholicism, I'd start a Karl Rahner reading group." So, in conclusion, so we're nearly there now. There is a passage in C.S. Lewis's science fiction novel, which I instantly thoroughly recommend, That Hideous Strength, in which one of the characters explains that there is a war going on the moon. It's a science fiction book. The darker areas are forests, he explains, and the backward people of the forests are being slowly subjugated by the enlightened people of the paler areas, where the forest has been cleared. If you could see the process speeding up, he explains, it would look like a man shaving. The man giving this explanation is on the side of evil. And from his explanation, we are to understand that the forest dwellers are, in fact, the good guys. Lewis is offering us an analogy. So much of what is good and noble, so much of what gives meaning and purpose to our lives is preserved by traditional practices and attitudes. They are resilient, yes, but the attack on them has been relentless, and little by little, the dense social networks in which these traditions can flourish and be passed on are being destroyed. Lewis published this book in 1945, and he was right to be concerned about what the coming decades would do to the traditions that he valued. His was a prophetic voice. And yet, even so, he would surely be flabbergasted by what has happened in the name of progress since then. Nevertheless, I want to end on a more optimistic note. My first motive for optimism is the woke ideology. Yes, it is insane, that's true, and hugely damaging, and protecting our children from it will be a hard fight. But, as I have explained, it signals the end of rationalism. Sanity will return eventually because it has to. In the end, our schools and universities will have to go back teaching people how to read and write and count because life actually can't go on without that. On the other hand, rationalism, I don't mean rationality, but this ideology of rationalism that says that that only things that can be articulated as a set of verifiable propositions have any interest or value is not coming back. The great enemy of the church of the modern era is as dead as St. George's dragon. My other source of hope is something I take from my reading of history, namely the power of societies to heal. Peoples who are forced to migrate vast distances after military disasters, collections of individuals from competing cultures who find themselves living together in dense cities, farmers who become nomads, nomads who become farmers. Check in on them after a few decades, and not always, but very often, they seem to have found a way of surviving and maybe even flourishing. The ultimate enemies of tradition are disruption to ways of life and to social networks. But given a breathing space, communities reform. People need tradition, they seek it out, and given half a chance, they build it back into their lives. If I had said this, if I was giving this talk in the 1970s, you might have thought, it is the young people who are rejecting tradition. They are never going to go back to it. But it isn't the 1970s anymore. It is pretty obvious today that the great anti-traditional experiment in society and in the church was a failure. Today, people are again looking for meaning, for structure, for some foundation for their lives. If they can't get it from the church, they will get it from some scoundrel like Andrew Tate. But that kind of fake tradition tends not to last very long. What we are building, however slowly, is a community characterised by genuinely useful traditions, sanctioned by the wisdom of the church, which will be a visible reminder of what can be done and serve as a beacon for others to follow. The last thing I would say is that we are not just concerned with human traditions. I believe very strongly that family life needs dense cultural traditions, cooking, singing, festivals, ways of dealing with birth and death and marriage. There are many cultures that can give us these things, and far from saying that I have one that is superior to what other people may have, I believe it is it is of great value that different cultures continue to exist alongside each other. But important as these local human cultural traditions are, at the core of what we have been talking about today, there is something that goes beyond them. It is something of God that has been passed on to us by tradition. These apostolic and ecclesial traditions, for those people who like to make fine distinctions, these liturgical and spiritual traditions, traditions of sacred art and poetry and so on, which are not themselves a divine revelation, are nevertheless essential to an ecclesial community that is also a real human community. They are indispensable to the passing on to humans in their concrete cultural circumstances of the wisdom of the generations, how to pray, how to worship, what attitude to take to death, to sin, to romantic love, and to new life. Something I attempt to explain a little in my writing is the way this tradition intersects with different human cultures, not to obliterate their differences, but to deepen their wisdom. These traditions form an aspect of Catholic culture which is human, but not merely human. They are cultural artefacts which are developed under the hand of divine providence. In restoring the shattered life of the Church on the basis of these traditions, we are not following the clever scheme of some enlightened thinker. We are following God's will, and for that reason, we can rely on God's assistance.